So that's trichloroethylene as another potential cause of Parkinson's disease. The third is air pollution. So when Dr. Parkinson was describing the disease that would later bear his name in 1817, he said he was describing something new. He said tremor had long since been described, but this disease where people have a stooped over posture, have a pill rolling tremor, a tendency to walk faster and faster and to fall forward. It was something new, something that had not been classified in the medical literature. And what's going on in 1800 London? Well, 1800 London had terrible air pollution. It had 20 times the level of air pollution that's present in London today. It had air pollution that's on par with what's in Delhi, India, and Beijing, China today. And it had twice as much as the air pollution that was found during the 1950s, when the Great Smog of London led to mass hospitalizations, thousands of deaths, and the first Clean Air Act 3 or 4 years later. For those of you who watched the Netflix, the series The Crown, this is the Great Smog of 1952 that occurred when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister. And studies have since linked air pollution. And when you see air pollution, when you see the smog over Los Angeles, you're actually seeing little pieces of dirt and soot suspended in the air. Those pieces of dirt and soot have a fancy term. It's called particulate matter. Some are large and they're readily coughed out or sneezed out, but some are really small, about 1/30th the width of your hair. And they can enter the nose, that's responsible for smell. And hitchhiking on those little pieces of dirt and soot are toxic metals, iron from brakes, lead from leaded gasoline, platinum from catalytic converters. And if you look at areas of the country that have high particulate matter, you can see it's in the upper Midwest, the South, and the Central Valley of California. And if you look at map of new cases of Parkinson's disease, you see that they tend to be higher in the Central Valley of California, in parts of Texas, and the Southeast, and the Midwest, where areas of air pollution are high. A study done by my colleague, Dr. Brad Rosette, and his colleagues at the Barrow Institute in Arizona recently found a strong association between particulate matter and Parkinson's disease. In red are areas of the country that had high rates of Parkinson's disease and high rates of particulate matter. And you can see it again in the upper Midwest. You can see it in, for example, parts of Texas, as we were showing. Conversely, in dark blue are areas of the country with low levels of air pollution, with relatively clean air, and with relatively low rates of Parkinson's disease. And so how do these toxicants in our food, water, and air interact with our body? Well, if you think about it, I'll stop there. One of my colleagues, Dr. Per Borghammer, a really smart Danish scientist, has postulated that Parkinson's disease begins in either the body, and when he says body, he's saying begins in the gut, or it begins in the brain. And he says if it begins in the body, it spreads from the gut up the spinal cord, and then into the part of the brain that's responsible for Parkinson's disease, which would be area number 4, the substantia nigra, for those who like a lot of science, and then to other parts of the brain. Conversely, if it begins in the brain, it begins in the smell center, the olfactory bulb, in area number 1, and then spreads downward through the spinal cord into the parts of the brain that are responsible for tremor and slowness of movement, and then only later down into the intestine. And if you think about this model, it really merges nicely with how these toxicants come into contact with our body. So we either ingest these toxicants, like the Marines at Camp Lejeune, who were ingesting trichloroethylene, or TCE, or perchloroethylene, in the water that they were drinking, potentially leading to a gut-first model of, or body-first model of Parkinson's disease, in which the misfolding of a protein called alpha-synuclein begins in the gut and then rises up through the spinal cord to the lower parts of the brainstem that are responsible for sleep disturbance and for regulation of blood pressure, then to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement and tremor, and then to the parts of the brain that are responsible for thinking and can cause dementia. Some of these, including trichloroethylene, can also be inhaled, or paraquat can be inhaled in which case the pathology might begin first in the smell centers of the brain, something called the olfactory bulb, then spread to the parts of the brain that are responsible for movement and tremor, such as the substantia nigra, and then only later spread down the spinal cord or into the cortices, causing later manifestations of constipation or later manifestations of difficulties with thinking. So that's how Parkinson's disease might be man-made. Now I'm going to talk to you about the rise of Parkinson's disease and conclude with this section on how it may be preventable. So when Dr. James Parkinson described the condition in 1817, he described 6 individuals with the disease. In 2017, the global burden of disease estimated that 6 million people had Parkinson's disease. So how do you go from a disease affecting 6 people to 6 million in just 2 centuries? Well, it can't just be aging alone, and it can't be genetics. It's got to be our environment. And right now, Parkinson's is the fastest growing brain disease in the world. Over the last 25 years, the number of people with Parkinson's disease has more than doubled. And if we don't change its course, the number of people affected by the disease will double again in the coming 25 years. Just to give you a feel for how common Parkinson's disease is, 200 Americans today will be diagnosed with the disease, and 100 Americans today will die from the disease. So the good news to all this is that if it's man-made, if Parkinson's disease is due to toxins in our food, water, and air, then it can be human-ended. And there's only one high-quality study that I'm aware of that has shown that the incidence or number of new cases of Parkinson's disease is falling. And that was a study done in the Netherlands called the Rotterdam study, in which they found a 60% decrease in the incidence or number of new cases of Parkinson's disease in a relatively short period of time. They were unable to provide, they didn't have a clear reason for their finding of a decreasing prevalence or incidence of Parkinson's disease. So I went backwards and looked at the 3 different environmental risk factors that I think are contributing to Parkinson's disease. Ideally, you would like to follow changes going forward, but we didn't have that data. So I went backwards and looked and found that the levels of pesticides, trichloroethylene, and air pollution in the Netherlands were all decreasing in the years or decades leading up to this decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. For example, in pesticides like DDT and other pesticides, they dissolve in our fat. So you can actually measure these chemicals in your fatty tissue. And between 1968 and 1986, in a relatively short period of time, their levels fell between 75 to 90% in our fatty tissue. In 1981, trichloroethylene levels in the outdoor air in the Netherlands were among the lowest in all of Europe. And air pollution, emissions of common air pollutants decreased by more than 50, in some cases up to 90% in the years leading up to the fall in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. So when we see areas of the world, at least in this study, that have decreasing use of pesticides, decreasing use of trichloroethylene, decreasing levels of air pollution, we see decreasing numbers of people being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So I've discussed with you how Parkinson's disease might be a man-made disease and thus fundamentally preventable. So when you think about Parkinson's disease, I want you to think that Parkinson's disease is a preventable disease in the vast majority of cases. And this may be true also for other brain diseases. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples. Pesticides many pesticides are nerve toxins, and perhaps not surprisingly, they're associated with a wide range of brain diseases, including intellectual disabilities. This is a study done by Dr. Virginia Rao, who's an outstanding researcher at Columbia University in New York. And she's been following children who've been exposed to a pesticide called Chlorpyrifos in urban environments in New York City. Now, Chlorpyrifos, you may not know, but if you've eaten an apple in the last few years, last 5-10 years, you've likely eaten Chlorpyrifos, because over half of apples in the United States have Chlorpyrifos on them. And Chlorpyrifos is a nerve toxin. That's how it works. And in this study, they looked at levels of Chlorpyrifos, abbreviated CPF, and the umbilical cord blood of babies, of fetuses, when they were born. And then they correlated the level of Chlorpyrifos in the umbilical blood. So this is the blood that's coming from the mother passing in through the placenta to the baby, and found that the higher the level of chlorpyrifos in the umbilical cord blood, the lower the IQ was. They report evidence of deficits in working memory and intelligence quotient as a function of prenatal exposure. They found this at age, I believe, 5 years of age, and in this study at age 7. So the environment, your exposure to pesticides for women passing it to their babies is associated with their intellectual abilities at 5 years and at 7 years. And they report that these findings are important in light of continued widespread of chlorpyrifos in agricultural settings and possibly longer-term educational implications of cognitive deficits. A separate study estimated that pesticides like chlorpyrifos cost 26 million American children 17 million IQ points. Intellectual disabilities is not the only disease that's linked to pesticides. ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, is likely linked to pesticides as well. Multiple studies, including those done in Italy, have linked soccer playing to ALS. This study looked at new cases of soccer players among Italian players, and they found 8 individuals with ALS, whereas the number of expected cases was only supposed to be about 1.2. So the standardized morbidity ratio, which is a fancy way of saying that there was a 6 times higher rate of of ALS among soccer players than would be expected, an outcome that's very, 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 very unlikely to be explained by chance. And in this study, they also compared soccer players to basketball players and cyclists, finding that there was no basketball player or cyclist who developed ALS, suggesting that it's something perhaps inherent to the sport soccer that's linked to ALS. And so what are the 2 things that are inherent to soccer playing that wouldn't be found typically with basketball players or cyclists? Second is repeated head trauma from heading the ball. And the first is the head trauma from repeat heading the ball. And the second is potentially exposure to pesticides on soccer fields, exposure either through the skin for direct contact with the skin with pesticides, or inhaling these pesticides while playing, or bringing pesticides home on your soccer cleats and having that pesticide be exposed to in your own residence. A third environmental risk factor is air pollution, which may be a major contributor to Alzheimer's disease. These are just 2 studies just from this year. One, a report in the media in Scientific American talking about how airborne toxins increase our risk for cognitive disability and disease. And a second in an academic journal called Neurology, showing an association of that particulate matter, the small pieces of dirt and soot that you see in the smog, and Alzheimer's disease pathology. And we're all being exposed to this. So if many of you remember the Canadian wildfires, especially if you lived in the Northeast in this past summer, and this is a picture of New York City when the skies over the Big Apple turned orange. And this level of particulate matter in June in 2023 is exactly what the skies over London may have looked like when Dr. Parkinson described Parkinson's disease in 1817, because the level of particulate matter in New York City in June 2023 is on par with what was found in 19th century London. So if you're interested in how toxicants in our food, water, and air are contributing to brain diseases from autism to Alzheimer's disease, I invite you to our symposium on the brain and environment in Washington, D.C. on May 20th, so just next month. You can learn more about the symposium and register for this symposium at our website, brainandenvironment.org, and there's a QR code for those that might be interested. I'm going to leave you on a high note, I hope. And the high note is that we can change the course of diseases. And in fact, we've changed the course of diseases multiple times in the past. We live in a world that's free of smallpox because we developed a vaccine for smallpox. We live in a world where typhus and where yellow fever and where many different infectious diseases are extraordinarily rare. And in many cases, it's because ordinary people like you watching this broadcast have changed the course of diseases because you've said we've had enough. And in 1938, communities throughout the United States, including swimming pools, houses of worship, would all close down this summer because they were fearful of the spread of polio. Ordinary Americans had enough, and they contributed dimes and mailed them to the White House because President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had polio, and they thought if we raise enough money, we can change the course of polio. And they did. 17 years after the March of Dimes began, Jonas Salk in Pittsburgh developed a vaccine that protected people against polio. Today, we live in a world that's largely free of polio. We have no cure for polio. We have no highly effective treatments for polio. We just live in a world where polio almost doesn't exist. In 1980, a 13-year-old girl was struck by a drunk driver, knocked out of her shoes, and killed. 4 days later, her mother, Candace Lightner, is lobbying the state legislature in California to change the laws against drinking and driving. At that time, drinking and driving was legal in some states in the United States, and she said it was this only socially permissible form of homicide in society. Within 8 years, she and her colleagues had formed Mothers Against Drunk Driving. The drinking age in the United States is raised from 18 to 21. Drinking and driving is illegal in all 50 states, and the blood alcohol level is dropped to 0.08. Today, because of the efforts of Candace Lightner, who's still living, and her colleagues, 10,000 fewer children, 10,000 fewer Americans die from drinking and driving per year. 10,000 schools, 10,000 communities, 10,000 families are not ripped apart because of the efforts of people like Candace Lightner, who made drinking and driving socially unacceptable and illegal. 7 years after Candace Lightner found her megaphone and changed the course of drinking and driving, not just for America, but around the world, Larry Kramer and his fellow activists formed a group called ACT UP in New York City because people in his community were dying from a uniformly and rapidly fatal condition known as AIDS. And in the setting of huge discrimination, they adopted a model of silence equals death, because for people like Larry Kramer and his peers, silence equaled death. And they changed the course of HIV by barricading themselves in the streets of New York, by overtaking the New York Stock Exchange, by taking over pharmaceutical companies who were developing effective treatments for HIV, but were making them too expensive and therefore inaccessible to the people who needed them the most. Within 8 years, after Larry Kramer and his colleagues formed ACT UP, we had the first protease inhibitors that could be used to treat HIV. And today, HIV is associated with a near normal life expectancy. Even more powerfully, millions of us, including possibly many of you listening, including possibly me, don't have HIV because we figured out how to prevent HIV with a simple intervention called a condom. If we can change the course of polio, if we change the course of drinking and driving, if we change the course of HIV and AIDS, we can change the course of brain diseases, which today are the leading source of disability in the entire world. We have obligations to receive gifts, and these are all gifts we received from previous generations, but we also have an obligation to reciprocate. And I think we need to act now in our generation to make these brain diseases, including intellectual disabilities, including autism, including ALS, including brain cancer, including Parkinson's disease, including Alzheimer's disease, all increasingly rare, not increasingly common. In our book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, we provide a prescription for beginning that journey. All the authors are donating all their proceeds from the sales of these books to efforts to prevent and end Parkinson's disease. And if you can't afford a copy of the book, if you just email us at info@endingpd.org and give us your mailing address, we'll send you a copy for free, especially if you live in the United States. So if you can't afford a copy of this book and you want to learn about how we can prevent and end Parkinson's disease, just email us at info@endingpd.org, and we'd be delighted to send you one. Also, if you've worked with these chemicals or worked with pesticides or have thoughts or suggestions or at points of disagreement or want to educate me on some topic related to any of these brain diseases, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at info endingpd.org. And with that, I'd be delighted to take any questions that you have.